Hello everyone, and welcome back to the second part of Chapter 10. So as I mentioned in the last class, the first module basically spanned from conception right up until the end of infancy, and the second module is going to focus on childhood. So this is the longest of the four. It's slightly longer than the last one, but after this, the next two modules on adolescence and adulthood will be a lot shorter. So let's get started. Module 10.2 is Infancy and Childhood, Cognitive and Emotional Development. So as babies grow from infancy throughout childhood, the development that they undergo in many areas is astounding. If you think of all of the different kind of progress that a child makes from birth up to the age of, say, 10, it's amazing how much they learn and how much they grow within that time period. So one of the key insights to emerge from several lines of research into development is that certain periods seem to be particularly important for long-term functioning. These sensitive periods are windows of time during which exposure to a specific type of environmental stimulation is needed for normal development of a specific ability. So one of the most common examples we give for this is language. You've probably heard, I believe I would have mentioned it maybe last semester if we talked about case studies, but there's the story of a girl named Jeannie. And essentially what happened to Jeannie is that she was locked away for her entire childhood in a room. She wasn't allowed to interact with the rest of her family. And so basically when she was rescued at the age of 13, she had no verbal language ability, just because she simply had never been exposed to language. And so despite the fact that it was a very tragic story, they actually learned a lot from it, because basically what they found out was that if you don't learn language within a certain period in childhood, it seems like you'll never really fully kind of grasp all the intricacies of language. So they were able to teach Jeannie to speak, and she was able to communicate fairly well, but she could never fully grasp all kind of the minor intricacies of grammar and things that go along with the language. So from that example and from many other examples like that, scientists have determined that there seems to be some kind of critical or sensitive period in which it's kind of important to get that exposure to environmental stimuli such as language in order to be able to fully develop your own skills. So over the past century, many psychologists have attempted to explain how children develop and explain their mental abilities, and one of the most influential figures in the search was Jean Piaget. So you may have heard of Piaget's name before. He's very famous in terms of child psychology, and we are going to talk about some of his most famous theories on child development. So cognitive development is defined as the study of changes in memory, thought, and reasoning processes that occur throughout the lifespan. So Jean Piaget was a Swiss psychologist who proposed that children's cognitive abilities unfold naturally. So if you remember back to the last module when we talked about stage theories, he proposed a very influential stage theory of children's cognitive development. So according to Piaget, learning is all about accumulating and modifying knowledge, which involves two central processes. So when you are faced with a new stimulus or a new bit of information, you can do one of two things. You can either assimilate that information, which means fitting the new information into the belief system that you already possess, or you can accommodate the information, which is a creative process by which people modify their belief structures based on experience. So they basically make new categories for information. And so one of the most basic examples I could give you for assimilation and accommodation would be the fact that children, when they're young, if they see someone with long hair, they assume it's a girl, and if they see someone with short hair, they assume it's a boy. So that's just something that they kind of pick up on very early in childhood. And so basically, if a young child encounters, say, a boy with long hair, then if they are looking at that individual and they say, okay, well, that must be a girl because of the long hair, then they're assimilating. They're basically taking this new person that they've never encountered before and kind of fitting them into a category they already have, which is long hair, therefore it's a girl. But if they are able to look at that boy with long hair and say, okay, you know what, maybe some boys can have long hair, maybe some girls can have short hair, that would be an example of accommodation. So kind of creating different categories for new information. Another example would be, say if you've probably met children who, call everything doggy, like any animal, anything on four legs, they call doggy. That's them assimilating. If they learn what a dog is, and then suddenly every four-legged creature around them they're calling doggy. Whereas once they're able to distinguish and say, okay, that one's a kitty, this one's a dog, then that's an accommodation because they're basically creating a new category to allow for that new information that they've obtained. So as I mentioned, Piaget proposed a stage theory of cognitive development. So he said that both of those processes, the assimilation and accommodation, were constantly interacting as children go through 4 distinct stages of cognitive development. He said there was a sensory motor stage, a pre-operational stage, a concrete operational stage, and a formal operational stage. And we'll talk about each of those in a bit more detail. So essentially, he believed that movement from one stage to the next occurs when the child achieves the important developmental milestone of that stage. So just like I talked about in the last class when I mentioned, stage theories and how there's usually some kind of milestone or big event that distinguishes between one stage or another, Piaget had that kind of developmental milestones embedded in his theory as well. So the first stage is the sensory motor stage, and this stage spans from birth to about 2 years of age. So it includes some of the kind of age range that we talked about in the last class. So basically Piaget said within these first 2 years of life, infants are thinking about and exploring the world based on their immediate sensory experience. So they're using their sensations, so they're seeing, they're feeling, they're tasting, and then their motor skills such as grabbing and mouthing in order to experience the world around them. And that's why it's known as the sensory motor stage. And so during this time, infants are completely immersed in the present moment. If an item is out of sight or out of reach, it will actually cease to exist in the mind of the infant. So therefore, the first major milestone that's proposed by Piaget, so the thing that you kind of have to overcome to move out of this stage, is object permanence, which is the ability to understand that objects exist even when they cannot be directly perceived. And I guess it's important to note that I said move out, but really the milestone itself doesn't necessarily, obtaining that milestone doesn't necessarily mean that they're ready to move on to the next stage. It's just kind of the major milestone that has to occur within this stage. So essentially, if you are playing with a really small child and say you have a ball or a rattle and you put it under a blanket, in their mind, in that child's mind, that item ceases to exist. They don't even believe it to be real anymore. And so grasping that concept of object permanence, that an item continues to exist despite the fact that you cannot see it, that represents the beginning of the capacity to use mental imagery and symbols. Because of course, if you only believe that things exist when you can see them, you're not really going to be able to use symbols to represent something, because in your mind, if you can't see it, it's gone. So that's a very important developmental milestone of the sensory motor stage. Then we have the pre-operational stage, which spans ages 2 to 7. So this stage is devoted primarily to language development. As you can probably imagine, children between the ages of 2 and 7 are really kind of exploding in terms of their vocabulary and their language capacity. And so in the pre-operational stage, we are developing language, we're developing the use of symbols, like we kind of mentioned in the last stage, pretend play. So if you've ever observed a kindergarten class, my mother was a kindergarten teacher for many years, so I spent a lot of time in her classroom. Pretty much the majority of the time that those students have free time, they're in the little kitchen, pretending that they're chefs, or pretending that they're, a husband and wife and children, and they have to feed their family. And so pretend play is very important at that stage in life. And also mastering the concept of what is known as conservation. So conservation is kind of the major, I guess we would say, developmental milestone of this stage. And so conservation refers to the fact that the quantity or amount of an object is not the same as the physical arrangement and appearance of that object. So for example, a liquid. A lot of children, if they are particularly young children, they will think that if you have a short kind of wide glass and then you take that, say, juice and pour it into a tall narrow glass, that because now the liquid is higher, that therefore that means there is more liquid in that glass. So they're unable to kind of grasp that just because the appearance changes doesn't necessarily mean the volume or the amount of something changes. So that would be basically the concept of conservation. Piaget also believed that children in this stage cannot take another person's point of view because their thinking is egocentric. Egocentric, you've probably all heard the word ego. It kind of, if someone has a big ego, they only think of themselves, they think really highly of themselves. So in this case, we're basically saying the child is really only able to kind of think of themselves and the way they feel and what they're experiencing. They're not able to kind of put themselves in someone else's shoes and kind of imagine how they might be feeling or what they might be thinking. However, this is the point at which Piaget's conclusions kind of really became not universally accepted. It was shown that children may not be interpreting the task correctly in terms of conservation. So we saw that the results were very different when M&Ms were used instead of pennies. So if you put 5 pennies in a row and they were really close together and then you spread them out, a lot of the time the child would say that there's more in the row that's spread out because it's longer. But when using M&Ms, which were kind of a source of reward for children, it didn't matter if you spread them out or put them close together. The child was able to kind of acknowledge that there was still the same amount there. So it wasn't necessarily evident that the children were actually understanding what the task was implying when they were asked, which one has more in the penny example. And it's shown that even infants have a basic understanding of less and more. So despite the fact that Piaget's theories were very influential, and this is something we still talk about today, not necessarily completely backed up by the scientific evidence. So this is a little figure that shows you kind of what we're talking about for conservation. So you can see the first example is what I brought up as my first example, basically in pouring that short kind of wide glass of liquid into a tall narrow glass. Children will often say that there is more simply because it's longer, and so they perceive it as being more. And then the same thing with the pennies. If you spread the row of the pennies out, a lot of the time they would say it's more because it kind of looks longer at that point. So not being able to understand that the amount of liquid or the amount of pennies is the same in both cases would be an example of kind of failing that conservation task, not being able to understand conservation. Although, as I kind of just mentioned, Piaget clearly underestimated the cognitive abilities of young children in some ways, researchers have identified common errors that very young children make, but older children do not. So he may not have been completely right in some of his conclusions, but there are definitely major deficits in terms of cognitive ability and reasoning ability in young children. So for example, very young children often commit what are known as scale errors, in that they try to interact with miniatures of objects as if they were the real thing. So for example, you can see the children in the pictures in 10.8, especially that little guy in B there, he's trying to fit himself into that tiny car. So they don't quite understand that it's not a real, it's only a model of what it's pretending to be. It's not actually kind of like a real object that they can interact with normally. And so these types of errors tend to decline by around 2 to 2.5 years of age, but in the first couple of years of life, they are very common. At around 3 years of age, children begin to think symbolically and can understand that a scale model of a room can symbolize the actual room, which is really cool. You often see children playing with, doll houses and things, and they'll have them set up to kind of look like a miniature of their house. And it's really cool that at that point they're actually able to understand that, the rooms in that dollhouse represent the rooms in their actual house, and kind of play in that more symbolic way. Next, we have the concrete operational stage. So this spans ages 7 to 11, and this is the stage at which children start to develop skills in logical thinking and manipulating numbers. So at this point, they are capable of conservation. So that's one of the major kind of milestones that they would have had to achieve during the pre-operational stage. And so at this point, they're able to classify objects by properties such as size, value, and shape. They're capable of transitivity, which is important. So if x is more than y and y is more than z, then that means that x must be more than z. So being able to kind of relate things together like that and kind of flip operations around. So, like if 4 times 2 is 8, then 2 times 4 must be 8, and therefore 8 divided by 4 will be 2. So kind of reversing operations like that is part of that transitivity. Children in this stage may still make errors when they're asked to think about abstract ideas, so that's really the only thing that they haven't fully grasped at this stage yet, if they're talking about things that aren't kind of in the here and now. But they do understand conservation, reversibility, and cause and effect relationships. So they are definitely really improving in terms of their cognitive abilities. And finally, we have the formal operational stage. So formal operational stage basically spans age 11 to adulthood. So at this point, we're basically saying kind of the rest of the life. And so this stage involves the development of advanced cognitive processes such as abstract reasoning and hypothetical thinking. So the type of scientific thinking that we talk a lot about in these courses, being able to gather evidence and systematically test hypotheses, kind of create theories, that kind of thing is characteristic of this stage. So once somebody reaches that point where they're able to hypothesize specifically about things that are not kind of currently present, things that aren't in the here and now, that will be at the point in which they are pretty much transitioning to that formal operational stage. And so children and adolescents who have reached this stage can now reason about situations that they haven't actually experienced firsthand. So definitely they've kind of passed that hurdle of egocentricity and not being able to take the perspective of others. And here's a nice little diagram table that kind of summarizes what we were talking about there, so you can see the ages. So definitely this is a really important theory, despite the fact that there are a few things that aren't exactly perfect about it, it is still something that is relied on a lot and talked about in pretty much any child psych class you'll ever take. So you should definitely be familiar with the names of the stages, the kind of time frames for each stage, as well as some of the major kind of milestones or hurdles that are kind of encountered in each. So now we're going to talk a bit about evaluating Piaget's theories. So as I kind of mentioned and alluded to a couple times, his theories weren't perfect. There were still things that could definitely be improved upon, and so we're going to talk a bit about some of the things that he might not have been as correct about. So his central ideas were definitely well supported, that new reasoning abilities depend on the emergence of previous, so they kind of come over time, kind of piece by piece. We start to kind of fill in the missing puzzle in terms of our cognitive processing. And further research into the minds of even the youngest infants has shown that he may have underestimated some aspects of infant cognitive abilities. So he was definitely right in that, progress kind of occurs within the stages, but maybe not so right in terms of just how little, say, for example, infants and young children were able to understand about the world around them. So if you look at the Working the Scientific Literacy module section in this, Working the Scientific Literacy Model section in this chapter, it does kind of take you through some of the ways in which he may have underestimated some of the cognitive abilities of infants. So the core knowledge hypothesis states that infants have inborn abilities for understanding some key aspects of their environment. We can attempt to measure what infants know by examining the habituation-dishabituation response. So habituation basically refers to a decrease in responding with repeated exposure to an event. So basically, if say you put a strange new object in front of a child, at first they're probably going to stare really long and hard at it because it's something they haven't seen before and they're fascinated by it and they kind of want to know what's going on. But over time, it kind of becomes less striking to them, and so they kind of start to lose interest in it. So that would basically be habituation. Over time, you kind of respond less and less to something that you've been repeatedly exposed to. Whereas dishabituation refers to an increase in responsiveness with the presentation of a new stimulus. So in order to kind of recapture the attention, we can introduce a new stimulus, and that kind of leads to an increase in responding to that new stimulus. So these measurement techniques have allowed us to test whether infants understand many different concepts, including abstract numbers. We've actually been able to look at the numerical abilities of infants using habituation and dishabituation responses. So looking at 4 versus 12 of a certain shape at 2 days old, we do actually see that infants will look longer when the number of shapes matches the number of sounds. So if they're making like a beeping sound or like a buh, buh, buh sound, and it matches, the amount of sounds matches how many objects are there, they are more likely to kind of look longer at that when it matches than if it doesn't match. Of course, there are many potential issues with this type of research, but the conclusion remains that cognitive development in young infants may be a lot more sophisticated than Piaget assumed, and therefore it is important for us to view children as complex learners who use sensation and movement to develop their cognitive abilities. So the summary basically is that he had a lot of good ideas and there was a lot that he was right about, but he may have underestimated kind of just how cognitively cognitively advanced infants and young children can be at times. And here we have a figure that basically represents what I was just talking about in terms of testing whether or not infants can kind of distinguish between different numbers of something. So the making the sounds like the da 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 or the da da da, depending on how many objects there are. We do see that even very young infants will kind of look longer when the amount of sounds matches the amount of objects than when it does not. So it does seem to be that they can distinguish whether or not the pairing is correct in that case. So despite some of the potential issues of Piaget's research, it has had a long-lasting impact on modern developmental psychology and has inspired numerous other researchers to study cognitive development as well. So despite, whether or not he had some issues with his research, he was one of the very first to start studying cognition and cognitive development in young children. So there was a Russian psychologist named Lev Vygotsky, and he emphasized social-cultural influences. So basically the fact that your society, the social groups that you're a part of, your peer groups, your family, your friends, all of those types of stuff, as well as your culture and your cultural background, can influence your development as well. So he proposed what's known as the zone of proximal development, basically stating that development is going to be ideal when children attempt skills and activities that are just beyond what they can do alone. So you're not going to take a kid who's just learning how to add and subtract and start teaching them long division. You're going to want to kind of build on those skills slowly and kind of teach them something that's just a little bit more difficult than what they're doing. Say if they're adding single numbers, now you're going to teach them how to add, a double-digit number to a single-digit number. And so basically, what you should do is keep the child within that zone of proximal development. So you're basically having them attempt skills that are just outside of what they can do alone, but also provide them with guidance from adults in their life who are attentive to their progress. So in order to keep children in this zone, the caregivers are going to use what's known as scaffolding, which is a highly attentive approach to teaching in which the teacher matches the guidance to the learner's needs. So again, you're using the zone of proximal development, so you're only really attempting things that are just beyond what you can already do, but you're also, you have that adult there who's kind of helping them along the way and basically encouraging them to try things that are kind of just outside of their reach and that build on the other skills that they've just most recently acquired. So now we're going to talk a bit about social development, attachment, and self-awareness. So attachment is something that's a really important topic in terms of psychological development, particularly in children. And we actually see that the types of attachment that we see in infancy and childhood are very highly correlated with the attachment styles of the infants and children later on in life, so when they're in adulthood. So attachment is defined as the enduring emotional bond formed between individuals, initially between infants and caregivers. So that's pretty much your first form of attachment. When you are born, you develop probably a near immediate attachment to the person who's providing you with care, providing you with shelter and food and all those other basic needs that you have. So motives to form attachments are deeply rooted in our psychology, and infants draw upon many behaviors that are geared towards seeking attachment. So when infants are crying, cooing, gurgling, and smiling, all of those things hopefully help to kind of foster the attachment between a child and their caregiver. For a long time, it was thought that attachment motivation was based primarily on biological drives. So, obviously we're attached to our mother, for example, because she feeds us, or our caregiver because they feed us. But then Margaret and Harry Harlow, they actually did some really interesting but also kind of sad studies with rhesus monkeys. And they demonstrated the importance of something called contact comfort, which is the pleasure of being touched and held. So I have a YouTube video link here. Unfortunately, obviously within this context, I can't show you the video as I usually would in class, but I'd like you to pause now and take a few minutes to watch that video. It's very short, but it'll just show you a little bit about what was going on in Margaret and Harry Harlow's research. So you won't be able to get the link here, but if you go to our PowerPoint slides in Moodle, if you've got them open and you're following along, you should be able to hold control and click the link, or I believe you might even be able to copy and paste, and you can go to the webpage and hopefully watch that video. So basically what happened in Harry and Margaret Harlow's research is that they had these baby monkeys, and they noticed they had separated from their mothers, and they noticed that the babies would get very distressed every time they removed the cloth pads that lined the cages they were in. And so what they hypothesized was that the baby was essentially gaining some sort of comfort from those soft cotton pads. And so basically they designed an experiment in which there were wire mothers, which were basically just a wire form that kind of very, very loosely resembled a monkey. And sometimes it would have, a bottle of milk, so it was a thing feeding the baby monkey. And then at other times, they had a cloth monkey in the cage, and that cloth monkey would sometimes feed and sometimes not feed the baby monkey. And so basically, in each cage, you had the cloth mom and the wire mom, and it varied which one was the one that was actually providing the food. And so what they noticed was that regardless of whether or not the cloth monkey was the one that was giving food, so even if the wire monkey was the one that was providing the food, the baby spent far more time with the cloth mother in all scenarios. And what that kind of showed is that they must have been gaining some kind of comfort simply from having that, that soft touch, that comforting touch. And that was very influential in terms of kind of teaching us that attachment isn't necessarily just about who provides us with food, who fulfills the basic needs, but that there is also that kind of comfort that's associated with attachment as well. So once babies become attached to their caregiver, separation can be very hard. Between 6 to 8 months is when typically babies begin to become wary or fearful of strangers, and basically that's what's known as separation anxiety. So separation anxiety is the distress that most children develop when their primary caregiver temporarily leaves them with strangers. It tends to begin around this time, so the 6 to 8 month mark, and last usually until the middle of the second year. It can sometimes last up to around 3 years of age, and in cases in which attachments were insecure during this period, that separation anxiety can last a lot longer than that. So in order to study the nature of attachment between babies and their mothers, a researcher named Mary Ainsworth devised a method known as the strange situation, a way of measuring whether the infant was attached by observing how infants behaved when exposed to different experiences that involved anxiety and comfort. And again, I have the video here, so if you want to pause now, go to your PowerPoint notes and either, press Control and click the link, or I think you could even right-click on the link and click Open Hyperlink, and you'll be able to watch that video because it's a good illustration of this study that Mary Ainsworth had devised. So basically, as you could see in the video, the strange situation essentially involved several different phases. So at first you had a mother in the room playing with her child, and then you have a stranger come in, and the stranger starts to try to play with the child, and then the mother leaves, the child alone with the stranger, and then the mother eventually returns. And so basically at each stage, you're looking at the reaction that the infant has. So the reaction the infant has to the mother leaving, the reaction the infant has to the stranger coming, and the reaction they have to the stranger when they're left with the stranger, and then finally the reaction that the infant has when the mother comes back. So based on reactions in this strange situation test, it was found that babies were divided into 3 categories. So we have secure attachment, which is when the child sees the caregiver as a secure base and they turn towards them for comfort. The child cries or protests when the caregiver leaves, so they're upset to see the caregiver go, welcomes the caregiver back, and is clearly more attached to her than to the stranger. So in secure attachment, it's actually healthy to be showing a bit of separation anxiety when that person leaves. The other 2 types are both examples of insecure attachment. So there are 2 different kind of subtypes there. We have anxious ambivalent, which is when the child depends too strongly on the caregiver. So they're very kind of anxious in terms of needing that person there. And so they're very upset when the caregiver leaves. They're very fearful towards the stranger. When the mother returns or the caregiver returns, they may cry to be picked up, then demand to be put down. So they're kind of all over the place in terms of their emotions. It's very difficult to comfort a child who exhibits that anxious ambivalent attachment style. And then finally, there's avoidant. So avoidant, basically those children will behave as if they do not even need the caregiver at all. They don't care if the caregiver leaves, they don't care about the stranger, they don't care if the mom comes back, and they don't really make an effort to seek comfort upon the caregiver's return. So in that case, they're kind of just generally avoiding contact, as the name would imply. And then finally, researchers have since identified a fourth attachment style. So this wasn't something that was talked about during that those initial studies with the strain situation, but it has since been established that there is a fourth attachment style known as disorganized, which is essentially best characterized by instability. So I mentioned with the anxious ambivalent that there's a little bit of kind of like ambivalence or kind of going back and forth there, but the disorganized is basically kind of much more unstable. So the child has learned that the caregiver is both a source of fear and comfort. So, at times maybe the parent is really caring and loving, and other times they might be not, or they might be very kind of aggressive or angry. And the child experiences strong ambivalence. So even more so than we'd seen that anxious ambivalent attachment style. They may seek closeness, but then pull away or exhibit a freezing response in which they kind of seem paralyzed with indecision. So unfortunately, this type of attachment style is often associated with children who have been neglected or abused. And so that can kind of contribute to how they see the caregiver both as kind of that source of fear and a source of comfort. So they're a lot of the time they're kind of unsure how to react in many situations. So researchers have shown that one's attachment style largely reflects one's early attachment experiences, as I kind of just mentioned with the disorganized. The most important factor seems to be parental responsiveness. So for example, maternal sensitivity, whether or not the mother is really attuned to the infant signals, the infant cries and the mother pays attention to them and is able to kind of feed them and bathe them and clothe them kind of, when they are exhibiting that they need to be. And so while the attachment styles as an infant largely seem to mirror those in adult relationships, like I said, we do kind of see the same percentages in terms of the childhood attachment styles and kind of persisting into adulthood. The attachment style can change through the development of supportive relationships later in life. So just because a child is initially exhibiting that anxious ambivalent or that avoidant attachment or the disorganized attachment doesn't mean that with proper nurturing and care and the establishment of supportive relationships later on in life that they won't be able to overcome those issues. Now we're going to talk briefly about parenting and attachment, because obviously our parents, in being our kind of initial source of comfort and caregiving, they tend to have a lot of influence on our attachment styles. So in humans, the tension between helping others and being concerning for oneself reflects a conflict between two psychobiological systems. So I would say the majority of people kind of operate within the interplay of these two different systems. The first would be the attachment behavioral system, which is the system focused meeting our own needs and security. And then you have the caregiving behavioral system, which is the system focused on meeting the needs of others. And it kind of goes to reason that if a person feels insecure themselves, if they're not able to kind of really meet their own needs and feel secure themselves, then they're going to have a lot harder of a time considering the needs of others. So essentially, if you're unable to kind of fulfill the requirements of that attachment behavioral system, you're not going to be able to exhibit kind of the factors involved in the caregiving behavioral system. It's really important that parents be careful to not overemploy conditional approaches in their parenting. And conditional approaches meaning that, basically instead of just loving your child unconditionally, you're kind of only going to love them or pay attention to them or praise them if they do certain things or if they do things, the way you want them. And kind of taking your love or your kind of positive regard away in certain situations can lead to a lot of issues for the child later on in development. So basically what happens is it can interfere with intrinsic motivation, which would be doing things because they make you feel good. So if you're only praised in certain scenarios when you do things a certain way, then you're probably going to lose a lot of what you care about and really only focus on doing what gets you that praise or gets you that love and that appreciation. and it can really severely impact the self-esteem and emotional security of the children. So one thing really to watch out for in parenting is to not put conditions of worth on your child in terms of, I'll only love you if you do this, or if you behave this way, or if you achieve this. Children who experience their parents' regard for them as conditional report more negativity and resentment towards their parent, and they experience what's known as introjection, which is the internalization of the conditional regard of significant others, so that people are only kind of worth something to you if they do certain things under certain conditions. And this can unfortunately lead to a greater feeling of internal pressure to do well, which may cause unstable self-esteem and negative coping when faced with failure. So if you think of it, if a child feels that their parent will only love them and only support them if they do things a certain way and if they achieve certain things, then how do you think that child is going to react to failure? It's going to be very negative, right? It's going to lead them to probably act and behave in ways that are a lot more self-deprecating and self-harming than what a child who is told, try your best, but we love you either way. On the other hand, research shows that moral development and healthy attachment is associated with a more frequent use of inductive discipline. So instead of using that introjection or using the conditional regard that leads to introjection, we should try to use what's known as inductive discipline. It's a technique that involves explaining the consequences of a child's action on other people, which can help to activate a sense of empathy in the child. So instead of telling the child do this because, I won't care about you if you don't do it this way, or, be nice to other people, or, you're not a good person, I won't love you anymore. It's much better to say to the child, when you say these things to someone, you're hurting them, and think about how that child feels. Think about how you would feel if that was you. So kind of appealing to the child's sense of empathy is a lot more effective over time than using kind of fear-based tactics in terms of punishment and discipline. And now we'll talk briefly about self-awareness. So between the ages of 18 and 24 months, toddlers begin to gain what's known as self-awareness, which is the ability to recognize one's individuality, and it's often tested by observing reaction to reflection. So I know I talked about this, I think possibly in the memory chapter and cognition chapter last semester, I'm not sure. I feel like I mentioned this in class last semester, but one of the ways in which we test whether, say, an animal, for example, has a theory of mind, whether they are able to think about their thinking, is that we'll make them look at themselves in the mirror. And there's something called a dot test, where you put a dot on the head, say, of a chimpanzee that you're working with, and if the chimpanzee looks in the mirror and tries to kind of reach out and touch the face in the mirror, well, that's probably showing you that they don't really recognize that it's them. But if they look in the mirror and then they immediately touch their own forehead where the dot is, then that's showing you that they recognize that it's them that they're seeing. And obviously, we don't use these exact same techniques with humans, but it is kind of similar in terms of trying to see whether or not the child is actually able to recognize themselves and understand that they are a unique person. So as we mentioned when we talked about Piaget, young children are often described as egocentric. So Piaget and others at times would say that children only consider their own perspective, which implies that they lack the cognitive ability to understand the perspectives of others. So for example, young children sometimes will think that if they hide their eyes, you can't see them. Because clearly, if they close their eyes, if they cover their eyes and they can't see you, then that means you can't see them. So they're unable to understand that not everyone thinks the same thoughts they do and sees things in the same way they do. So Piaget had believed that children were egocentric until the end of the pre-operational phase, but a lot of modern research indicates that children do start to take the perspective of others long before this phase is complete. And this has been demonstrated in studies of theory of mind, which I kind of talked about a minute ago, but basically it's defined as the ability to understand that other people have thoughts, beliefs, and perspectives that may be different from one's own. So here's a very simple test of self-awareness. Basically, a child would sit kind of across from an adult and they're looking at a diorama from a different perspective. So this one in particular is known as kind of the 3-mountain task. And basically what you're doing is checking to see what the child thinks the other person can see. So if the child is able to understand that the other person's viewpoint isn't the same as their own, and, say that, well, I think that they would see, something different, then that would kind of prove to you that they're able to take the perspective of others, and they're not only able to think about what they see. If the child looks at the mountain and says, well, I see this, therefore that's what they see, then they haven't really passed that test for kind of being able to look past egocentricity. And here's another theory of mind task, and I really like this one. It's kind of interesting. So basically, what it's saying is that, say if you gave a child a box and the box said chocolates on it, or it looks like a chocolate box, because a 3-year-old child probably can't read chocolate. But anyway, it looks like a box of chocolates. The child opens it up and they find out that it's actually pencils and not chocolates. Then the critical point comes. You ask the child, if your friend opens the box, what is he going to expect to find? So it's a very interesting task, because if the child says, well, he'll think that there are pencils in there, why would he think there are pencils? He has no idea that there are pencils in there, but that's basically demonstrating that egocentricity. The fact that they assume that because they know there are pencils in the box now, that the child will also know that there are pencils in the box. However, if that child is able to say, well, he's going to expect to find chocolate, then that shows that they have, or at least they're developing that theory of mind. They're able to understand that even though I know what's in there and it's not chocolate, that other child has no way of knowing because they haven't looked yet. And so that's a really interesting kind of test of self-awareness, and whether or not a child can understand that other people don't necessarily know everything they know and think everything they think. Finally, I want to talk briefly about psychosocial development, and we'll come back to Erik Erikson a little bit later on in the chapter as well, in the adolescence and adulthood sections. But there was a German-American psychologist named Erik Erikson. He proposed a theory of development that consisted of overlapping stages, and his stages, unlike Piaget's, basically extended from infancy right up until old age. So whereas Piaget's, basically once you were in the formal operation, you were kind of, that kind of extended throughout adulthood, Erikson's theory basically went step by step from birth right up until death. And so he would say that people face developmental crises at each stage. So the first 4 stages of this theory cover infancy and childhood, and they are known as trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame, initiative versus guilt, and industry versus inferiority. So the very first thing that we grapple with is basically trying to develop a sense of security. So as an infant, you are unable to fend for yourself, and therefore you have to trust your caregiver to provide for you, right? And if you have a caregiver who kind of fulfills those needs and is able to provide you with adequate care, then you would successfully navigate that stage. So you would learn to trust versus, if you had a neglectful infancy and your needs weren't met, then you may develop a sense of mistrust. Next, in toddlerhood, so the child is basically starting to explore those feelings of autonomy, so kind of being their own person. Like we just said, when a child is very young in infancy and very early kind of toddlerhood, they don't understand that not everyone thinks the way they do and feels the way they do and experiences things the way they do. So this stage is very much about learning to be your own person and understanding that you're a unique individual, but at the same time, not being ashamed of kind of trying new things and being your own person. Early childhood is a very similar stage to toddlerhood in a way. So this one is marked by kind of the interplay between initiative and guilt. So in early childhood, you're basically, even more kind of coming into your own, becoming your own person, and you're starting to try new things. You're starting to try to develop different skills and things. You may be starting, school or preschool, and compared to your peers, you're trying to learn new skills and things. And so basically in this stage, you have to learn to take initiative, to take responsibility for yourself and start pushing the boundaries without feeling guilty about doing so. And then finally, in the 4th stage, which is childhood, you have industry versus inferiority. So at this point, you're really kind of well-rooted a lot of the time, or at least in our culture, basically in trying to kind of accomplish things. You're in school, you're learning more, you're competing with your peers, you want to be able to successfully navigate the tasks of life and kind of increase your feelings of control. And so in order for a child to successfully navigate this stage, they must feel like they're actually being able to kind of accomplish things in terms of learning new skills and new behaviors and things like that. Versus inferiority would be feeling that, you're not able to compete with your peers and kind of live up to the same level that they are able to attain. So by the end of those first two stages, the child is going to be ideally secure and feel a basic sense of having separate needs from others, so they've got that sense of autonomy. However, if not navigated successfully, they may struggle with feelings of inadequacy or low self-worth. If that third stage is navigated successful, the early childhood, the child develops increased confidence and a sense of personal control and responsibility. Successfully navigating the fourth stage will increase a child's feeling of being in control of their actions and allow regulation to achieve long-term goals. So they're starting to learn new skills, and if they're able to demonstrate those efficiently and effectively, then that would kind of indicate that they will be able to kind of succeed and achieve long-term goals and develop productive habits. So overall, it's clear that childhood ties together emotional development with feelings of confidence and the quality of one's key relationships. So there's a lot more going on within that childhood phase of life than you might have initially imagined. And for the end of this module, I just wanted to show you this diagram. I'll bring it back up again, I think in the adulthood section when I start to go through some of the other stages, but this is just a little synopsis of what we were talking about just then with Erickson stages. And that is it for Module 2. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Like I said, I knew it was going to be longer than the others. We're sitting at about 46 minutes right now, so this will be pretty much the full 50-minute class period. But the other one was only 35, and the next two should be a lot shorter than that. So hopefully you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting, and I will talk to you in the next video.